بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, in this short clip today I'm going to give you 5 strategies to help you optimize your health and prevent you getting unwell with coronavirus, inshallah. So I have a special interest in preventative and regenerative health. Often Western medicine looks at how we can treat the disease once it's established and minimize symptoms. But I have an interest in something called root cause medicine. And what I'd like to do is share some strategies from that with you. So the first tip will be social distancing. You'll probably sick to death of this, but the Prophet ﷺ said, if you hear of a plague in a land, then do not enter it. If it happens in a land where you are, then do not exit it. And this is from Bukhari. In real terms, this means that we should not be mixing households. That means no face-to-face iftars, no tarawih, no jama'ah, and no Eid. Of course, this is difficult, but it means social distancing and not emotional distancing, as one of my colleagues aptly reminded us. So that by all means, please use FaceTime, Google Hangout, Zoom, any other media that you can think of, and just pick up the phone, speak to your family, and certainly, keep each other in your du'as. However, it is difficult and you will be rewarded for your patience. The key thing to remember is that even if you don't get it, you may be carrying it and shedding the virus, and you may be responsible for somebody else's death if you do not maintain your social distancing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us in the Quran that he who saves a life, it is as if he saved the whole of humanity, whereas he who takes a life, it is as if he's killed the whole of humanity, and the reward for patience is unlimited. And alhamdulillah, we're in the month of Ramadan, where that reward is multiplied manyfold anyway. And I just want you to bear in mind that although the government may be relaxing the lockdown over this weekend, this does not symbolise the end of the virus. People, of course, are still dying. Our frontline workers are still very vulnerable. It just means that the intensive care unit, the ICU, has capacity for you or for other people if they become unwell. And that, it's worth bearing in mind that people that end up in the intensive care, only 50% of those make a recovery. And even after making a recovery, many of them will not go back to normal quality of life. Second principle, again, for our deen is hygiene. So the Prophet related that blessing in food lies in washing the hands before and after eating. This is from Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud and Ahmed. And that cleanliness is half of Iman, half of our faith, and that's from Sahih Muslim. So on the left hand side there's a slide that shows you how to wash your hands. Essentially you need to be washing your hands for 20 to 30 seconds with soap, and make sure you clean under your nails, you rub your thumb, you wash between your fingers, and you wash both surfaces of your hands, wash around the wrists, and then that you take the time to dry your hands thoroughly, because wet hands transmit infection. Hand hygiene is a substantial pillar of infection control. It's cheap, it's readily available, and it works. A study in the 1840s by Semmelweis showed that when medical students were approaching women in labour, they were not strict with hand washing, and that there was a 10% mortality in those women, whereas the midwives who were more careful around these things, there was a 2% mortality. However, when hand washing was formally introduced, this proportion of mortality, this mortality rate was reduced tenfold. Okay, next tip, boost your immune system. So that means getting adequate sleep. At the moment, of course, our sleep patterns are disrupted because of Ramadan. However, sleep is a regenerative process. The brain does not switch off, and it's busy repairing cells and detoxing your body. Disturbance to the sleep pattern longer term, not having a regular sleep pattern, poor sleep associated with a low mood, depression, cancer, inflammation, obesity. Many diseases stem from not sleeping is just like not servicing your car, or not, it starts to run into problems because they're not kept in check. So although, our sleep may be compromised, the amazing thing is that the extra power generated through our spirituality, through our ibadah, probably sustains us with less sleep. And we know that from deep forms of regenerative meditation, they can sometimes compensate for missing sleep, but are not a complete replacement. Exercise is the next thing. Exercise is known to revitalise us in our mood, but also in our immune system. It helps to keep us strong and healthy, probably by giving regular small doses of manageable stress, so the immune system is primed. The next thing is vitamin D. We know people that are vitamin D deficient are 20 times more likely to become critically ill with coronavirus, and that Blacks and Asians like ourselves, Black BME communities especially, require a lot more time in the sun to be able to generate adequate amounts of vitamin D. So this is something that we can replace very easily by taking 1 to 4,000 units of vitamin D over the counter to make sure that we replete. It's essential in mounting the immune response and is responsible for some of the chemicals involved in mounting the immune response. Okay, so the other supplements you may wish to consider are vitamin C and turmeric, both of which are potentially antiviral. There have been some studies using vitamin C in through a drip in New York and China, but we don't actually have any proper data on this. However, you will not come to any harm as a result of taking vitamin C or turmeric. The other really important thing is stress management. So the body doesn't really distinguish between modern day stress, such as financial strain, work strain, family strain, and prehistoric strain, such as being chased by a tiger. So if you have short bursts of stress, such as you would during exercise, your immune system actually upregulates and becomes more effective. However, when this is sustained, your immune system becomes very run down. Your body becomes goes into an inflammatory state where it doesn't really manage a lot of its metabolic processes properly. You're more likely to become diabetic because you need to have that glucose circulating around, and you don't mount as an effective immune response. This is why people who are chronically stressed or sleep deprived follow the same path and eventually end up getting ill more often. Fasting, of course, is a huge blessing. It helps to reset the immune system, especially if you fast for 3 consecutive days. And the last point is around the gut health and looking after the microbiome, and I'll talk about that later. Okay, tip number 4 is to tackle obesity and diabetes. Now, we know people that are obese are 37% more likely to suffer with critical complications of coronavirus, irrespective of their age and background. And the approach for tackling obesity and diabetes is very similar because both of them are essentially associated with insulin resistance. As I mentioned before, 60% of our population is in poor metabolic health. Some people may be thin on the outside, fat on the inside, meaning they have organ fat, which is highly toxic and may not be visible, which is why the advice will be similar for everybody. So the first thing will be to reduce your carbs, so that's bread, rice, pasta, potatoes and couscous by 50%. You could of course try things like lentil pasta or quinoa instead of the couscous. If you are going to go for potatoes, try and de-starch them and go for red and white varieties. If you are eating the grains, then switch to whole grain options and try and keep your portions, reduced to by about 50%, as I've said before. You need to cut out juices and sugar. These cause a massive spike in insulin and lead you to feeling hungry and grouchy very short while later. And as per the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, golden advice: eat less, eat in balance, eat in moderation, a third for water, a third for food, a third for air, and do not commit excess. If you'd like further information on dietary strategies, you could look at my earlier videos, but also you can consult dietdoctor.com and diabetes.co.uk. The other thing is that obesity and diabetes, and generally our metabolic health suffers when we sit for prolonged periods. So I call this sitting disease. It is the smoking of today, of the, of our decade, and it's because it makes us insulin resistant. We can counter this by just making the effort to move regularly. So rather than doing all your exercise in one go, you do need some fixed periods of exercise, but you need to make sure that you move around frequently, I would say every hour, so between 20 minutes and 90 minutes, make sure that you have some form of movement. While we're all at home, we're all in lockdown, it's an excellent opportunity to get the whole family to help out, and to work together, build some love and some teamwork, and do the housework together. That will keep you active and will help to tackle obesity and diabetes. Point number 5 is around reducing inflammation. This is easy and straightforward. You'll notice a lot of the advice is overlapping because, in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it very simple. The root cause of most modern illness is inflammation. Well, the solution is a generic solution in most cases. So for most of us, we need to avoid deep fried foods, sugar, junk and processed foods. We need to avoid vegetable oils, vegetable ghee, margarine and seed oils such as sunflower and rapeseed. We need to eat organic food as much as possible, so that we can avoid pesticides, toxins, hormones and unnecessary antibiotics. We should eat anti-inflammatory foods. Of these, vegetables such as broccoli are particularly effective because they contain a chemical called N-acetylcysteine, which works to quickly mop up any free radicals that we may have consumed or generated in our food. Kale and berries are also really good. They're high in antioxidants. The other foods to look for omega-3 rich foods such as chia seeds, grass-fed butter and oily fish. Butter ghee is also a source of butyrate, which supports our gut bacteria, and we should have plenty of fruit and vegetables with variety. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about supporting our gut health. So before I talk about gut health, there is some interesting research emerging that one of the reasons why we are suffering more so from coronavirus is not just complex socio-economic reasons and demographic reasons. The fact that there may be factors such as poverty, overcrowding, and perhaps that we're more prone to diabetes and heart trouble as a community, but also an epigenetic effect related to poor nutrition. So this may be generations of stress, it may be generations of poor nutrition, and over time it compromises our gut health and compromises our immunity. So the gut is the largest immune organ in the whole body. It contains 70% of all our immune tissue. It's also the barrier and the gatekeeper to the outside world, which means it keeps toxins and infection out, except if it becomes damaged, compromised or leaky. So it's important for us to maintain the integrity of our gut barrier and to look after those bacteria that help to keep us healthy by maintaining the gut barrier and by allowing us to generate the necessary energy and nutrients from our food. So we call this state a state of symbiosis, and healthy bacteria are not only diverse but also adaptable to change. There has been an interesting study looking at countries with increased parasitic stress. So countries, this is coming back to the hygiene hypothesis, where they're finding that, people that are in less sort of sterile conditions actually suffer with fewer inflammatory conditions. And the condition that they looked at in particular was Alzheimer's disease. They found that countries such as Kenya had very low rates of a condition such as Alzheimer's, whereas Western countries, UK, US, Germany, had very high rates of inflammatory conditions. And we're finding a similar trend in coronavirus. This is quite interesting because they compared the gut microbiome in children from, raised on a Western diet and children from these deprived communities. And they found that, children from environments which are less sterile actually had a more diverse gut microbiome and a more adaptable gut microbiome. So we have to look at those factors that we can modify. There are things that we can't do much about, like whether we're breast or bottle fed and what kind of birth our mother had and when we've had to take antibiotics. But there are certain things that we can control. Things like stress and exercise are in our control, but our biggest hit is probably our diet. what we're finding is that sugary and energy dense processed foods, common to Western diets, can reduce the adaptability of gut bacteria, and that adaptability is very important in fighting infection and keeping us resilient. One way to do this, one way to overcome this, is by increasing the prebiotic fibre in our diet. So the fibre that becomes a food and a source of support for healthy gut bacteria. This can be found in foods such as garlic, leeks and onions. And also unripe bananas are a good source of prebiotic fibre. We should decrease our use of simple sugar. As I've said before, on the low carb diet we should be taking the sugar out. We should avoid genetically modified foods because they contain something called glyphosate, which can be toxic and compromise the gut barrier. We should try to eat organic as much as possible to avoid poisoning ourselves with toxins and pesticides, but in particular in meat. The majority of antibiotics that we actually come across are in the meat that we consume rather than in the antibiotics that we take when we become unwell. And these antibiotics compromise our gut bacteria. We should also encourage our children to play in the dirt and get mucky so that they can boost their microbiome, but also for ourselves, handling food, preparing food, working in the garden seems to support better health, mental health and physical health. And there has been some research around ibuprofen type medications, so what we call non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and antacid drugs such as omeprazole. Now, if you need to take these medications, please do take them. However, taking them unnecessarily for prolonged periods of time has been associated with compromising the gut microbiome and leaky gut. What this means is that, most people don't need to be on omeprazole for life. There are very few people that fit that category, and at some point may be able to wean off or go on to the minimum dose needed. And likewise with painkillers, ibuprofen and such like, you should take them when you need to, but not necessarily take them on a regular basis unless you have a chronic inflammatory problem such as an arthritis. Okay, so I'm going to end my talk here. Before I do that, I'm just going to run through the 5 key points, inshallah, so that they are really nice and clear. So the first is social distancing, the second is hand hygiene, the third is making sure that you boost your immune system, so take your vitamin D, get enough sleep and enough exercise. Number 4, a low carb diet, so cut your rice, pasta, bread down by 50% and switch to whole grain options. And point number 5 is around reducing inflammation by cutting out toxic fats and seed oils, and trying to go for organic foods, fruits, vegetables, and having a variety of food sources. And lastly, please feed your gut. You need plenty of fibre in there to support your gut microbiome. Okay, inshallah, I hope this has been helpful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all shifa, protect us and relieve us from this wabah. Okay, jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.